A few years ago, following turmoil in my personal and professional life, I found myself near Lake Geneva and the wonderful French-speaking part of Switzerland. These circumstances prompted me to consider different worldviews and the roots of Western civilization. I looked into the answers advocated by the Christian faith and decided to test their authenticity by examining historical and archaeological evidence. In the face of concerns about the future of the world and the human race, society is obsessed with the issue of its potential extinction. Over the centuries, mankind has become increasingly alarmist. Eager for answers to these profound questions, I became interested in the most enigmatic book of the Bible, Revelation, and its strange prophecies about end times. No other book throughout history has provoked so much reaction and engendered such fantasy about the end of the world. The creatures described in the book of Revelation, such as the beast or the Antichrist, have always struck fear into men's hearts and have been the cause of intense speculation. The book has enormous sway, to the extent that the arrival of the year 1000 caused huge general anxiety referred to as millennial panic. In the 14th and 15th centuries, other calamities were interpreted as divine judgment, such as the Great Plague, which threw people into absolute terror. Today, more than ever before, new mass surveillance technologies, fears related to climate change, pandemics, and nuclear wars have increased interest in this 2,000-year-old message. We only remember the doom and gloom aspects of the text. But the book of Revelation is not at all what people generally imagine.
When the book is known as the Apocalypse, this creates a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding because the Greek term apocalypse means revelation.
It's the removal of the veil. It's the unveiling. It's the revelation.
One of the world's finest collections of religious manuscripts is located in Geneva. The Bodmer Foundation is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and houses 150,000 books. I decide to visit it to discover more about the Book of Revelation and its author. In fact, the book in the Bible known as the Book of Revelation is a prophetic revelation given by the resurrected Christ himself to the church. Despite controversy about the author and the exact date of writing, what we do know about this book is that it was drafted by a certain John, that Christian tradition refers to as the disciple and the apostle of Jesus.
The revelation of John is not the first example of a piece of apocalyptic literature. We know of apocalypses written from the end of the 3rd century BC and even 400 years before that. So, by the end of the 1st century AD, John's Book of Revelation is what I would call an accomplished example of this literary style. There are also apocalyptic texts in the Old Testament or Hebrew part of the Bible. Obviously, the Book of Daniel is the best known. And then there's the extra-canonical literature, the apocryphal literature which refers to a significant number of apocalypses.
The Book of Revelation was written on the island of Patmos in the 1st century AD. John is supposed to have seen a vision, a type of prophecy, that he transcribed so that it could be shared with the 7 churches in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. This sparked all sorts of questions in my mind, and I wondered whether Revelation and its message about the end times had a historical and archaeological basis. What message does it convey to believers in society in the 21st century? What were these 7 churches? Do they still exist? I decided to find out more about the origins of this book and to follow the trail of the 7 cities that Jesus addressed. So it was obvious where I should start my investigation. I would go to the island of Patmos, and then on to Turkey, to see the historic sites of the 7 churches. Will this trip help me understand the mysteries hidden in the book of Revelation? Will this quest answer my fundamental concerns? So here I am, on the island of Revelation. Patmos is an island belonging to the Dodecanese archipelago in the Aegean Sea, not far off the coast of Turkey. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This wonderful little mountainous island that is arid and 7.5 miles long has managed to jealously protect itself from the modern world, despite tourism and religious pilgrimages. It's at a hotel near the port of Scala that I meet up with Professor Mark Wilson. Renowned historian and author of several publications, Mark is considered to be one of the world's greatest specialists on Patmos and the 7 churches of Revelation.
Well, we're on a lovely Greek island called Patmos that today is about 60 kilometers off the coast of Turkey. But in the first century when John was here, this was part of the Roman province of Asia. So it's surrounded by many islands in all directions. On the one hand, it's a small isolated island, but then it's connected not only to other islands in the vicinity, but also to the Turkish coast. Well, apart from the New Testament, Patmos really is not mentioned very often in ancient sources. So it's sort of a forgotten island, but because it's mentioned in Revelation 1:9, all Christians around the world know the importance of this island and its significance for the book of Revelation. So in a sense, it's important in history through the book of Revelation.
The island is considered to be sacred. It's home to more than 500 churches spread across its terrain.
Well, in New Testament scholarship, there is very much a controversy whether John the prophet that we have in the book of Revelation is the same person who's the author of the 4th gospel and the letters of John. But for most Christians, and especially in the Orthodox tradition we have on the island, there is only one John. Well, he identifies himself in the book of Revelation several times by John. So the early church always believed this was John, one of the 12, beloved disciple, author of the gospel, one of the sons of thunder.
But can we trust tradition? Was it really John the Apostle who wrote Revelation and lived on the island of Patmos?
We see this because there are elements of vocabularies that belong only to this chain of writings: the Gospel, the Epistles of John, and the Revelation.
We find the same themes, the same underlying ideology, as what we find in the rest of the Johannine literature.
Mark is showing me an ancient baptistry, evidence of the time when John baptized new converts. Everything on Patmos points to the apostle having been on the island.
We have several traditions here on the island of Patmos related to the preaching of John. And most certainly as John was on the island, he would not have been locked up, I don't think. He would have had access to roam around the island. Certainly, John would have preached to the local inhabitants. And so it's not surprising that we have these traditions that some became believers and were baptized. Sometimes we have the impression that John is here alone on the island with the goats. It's just an isolated, rocky, barren island. But Patmos was inhabited in the 1st century. So there were military fortifications, there were temples on the island, and people lived here with John while he was in exile.
Above the small town of Rora overlooks the imposing monastery of St. John. The dark color of this fortress contrasts with the white houses erected all around the monastery. It was built in the 11th century on the highest place of the island to protect itself from the pirates of the Aegean Sea.
The monastery was built in 1088 by St. Christodoul, the Byzantine emperor of the time. Alexis I Comnene offered him the island of Patmos in its entirety to build a monastery he also financed.
We know of a priest by the name of Christodolus who comes in the end of the 11th century and receives permission to build this monastery here. And the monastery grows and develops over the centuries and becomes a center for monks here, not only for the production of icons, but of early manuscripts that we see here as well within the library.
This fortress-like monastery becomes all the more intriguing when we discover that it houses a mysterious library in its underground. It contains in its depths infinitely precious and carefully preserved work, including many thousand-year-old manuscripts. Among them is the oldest known copy of the Gospel of Mark.
The most precious manuscript and the oldest is Codex Purpureus.
This 5th century document is one of the oldest illuminated manuscripts in the world. Giannis, the library curator, takes meticulous care in showing me this precious artifact. The existence of this unique collection reveals how important the island of Patmos is for the Christian Orthodox world. From the Byzantine era to the end of the 19th century, several hundred manuscripts were collected here, making this the oldest and one of the most extensive libraries dedicated to the Byzantine period.
The most of them are ecclesiastical and liturgical manuscripts. Everything that the monks need for everyday life in the services.
And it also has inscriptions that give us some history of the background of Patmos at the time John would have been here.
I now want to find out more about the life of the apostle on Patmos, so I go to the monastery church in search of answers. The lavish church is adorned with icons and other artwork. But it is the magnificent frescoes covering the walls and exterior facade that get my attention. They witness to John's presence on the island. He is depicted accompanied by his disciple, Procurus, who followed him from Jerusalem.
Now we know that prisoners often were accompanied by attendants or by slaves, so it's very possible that John did not come alone. And the traditions that we see on icons here are when John received the revelation, he dictated it to Procurus, who wrote down the revelations of Jesus Christ.
But the question still remains, what was the Apostle John doing on such a remote island?
John is the disciple that Jesus most loved among the 12. He neglected fear, danger, and any other threat he might have suffered to follow his master. The love he had for Jesus led him to follow him until his death.
The Apostle John arrived in Patmos as an exile. He was deported by the Romans.
The Romans would exile political prisoners to islands all throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The book of Revelation really doesn't tell us specifics about how he came here. He says that he's on the island because of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. And he identifies himself as a brother and companion in the suffering.
The book of Revelation is set in a context of persecution, and John declares, I, John your brother, who share like you in the present distress. So there is a difficult time for all the churches, for all Christianity at that time.
One of the discussion points is the dating of the book of Revelation. The tradition in Orthodoxy is that it was under the Emperor Domitian, sometime in the 90s, that John was sent into exile. There's another stream of New Testament scholarship that sees the date of around 69.
It was during the first century that Christendom experienced its first period of significant persecution. Nero was the first emperor to have Christians massacred, including the apostles Peter and Paul, martyred in Rome in 65 AD. A few years later, Nero committed suicide, unleashing political turmoil across the whole Roman Empire. At the same time, there was a great uprising in Israel. In 70 AD, Jerusalem was besieged by the Romans. General Titus massacred the inhabitants in a bloodbath and destroyed the temple, forcing the Jews into exile.
Here we have a period in church history when the Christians have just been persecuted in Rome. We also have a Jew coming from the war zone in Jerusalem there, arriving in Ephesus. So a very tumultuous period in history, and for me, this works better historically for a date of Revelation. When we get to 95, the traditional date, we have no record of any persecution of Christians by Domitian in any of the ancient sources. And so with the political instability, I think if I was a Roman governor, I would like to get this leader out of the way for a period of time until the political and religious situation settles down.
I continue exploring Patmos. Just below the monastery of St. John, I discover a brilliantly white building that houses one of the most sacred places on the island, the Cave of the Apocalypse. According to tradition, for the 2 years they were on Patmos, John and Prochorus found refuge in this cave.
Well, there are a number of caves on the island, and certainly John would have had to have shelter somewhere during the time when it's cold, when it's raining here on the island. And the cave might have been a place not only of shelter, but of spiritual retreat, where he could pray, he could meditate. It is very likely that the tradition is correct that John was in this cave when he received his revelation.
The first thing you notice on going down into the cave is that it has been made into a place of Orthodox worship. The building is attached to the rock wall.
The natural part of the cave comes to marry with the divine part of the holy monastery. You can see, and it is impressive, the place where John the theologian laid his head to rest, as well as a small cavity where he put his hand to get up or kneel to pray. There is also the place of the tear in the rock in 3 parts that symbolizes the Trinity of God. This is where John's student, Prochorus, posed to write everything John told him.
It is here that John received his revelation. First, he heard a powerful voice behind him, similar to a trumpet. Then the risen Christ himself appeared to him in all his glory, shining like the noonday sun. The book of Revelation describes that scene in detail. Then I turned to see the voice that spoke with me, and having turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the 7 lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet, and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. His feet were like fine brass, as if refined in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. He had in his right hand 7 stars. Out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. When he saw Christ, the apostle fell at his feet as if dead, aware that the risen Lord was speaking to him personally. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, "Do not be afraid."
So John's reception of this series of visions that he has in Revelation, there's a lot of discussion how this happened. Does he receive this at one time, and Prochorus, as an amanuensis, a scribe, is simply write them out chronologically? I think it's on the Lord's Day that John is on the island here when the beginning of the visions take place. And he begins to record these, and over a period of time, we're not told whether it's days or weeks, the vision is expanded. And then John, with his scribe, they begin to formulate these visions into a document that ultimately has become the Revelation.
John is terrified. The vision shows Christ in the middle of 7 golden lampstands, holding 7 stars in his right hand. His powerful voice then resounds. What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. The message of this vision is full of imagery and in code, as is the whole of the book of Revelation. But what do these 7 lampstands represent, and why speak to these 7 churches?
Jesus is in the middle of these 7 lampstands. He is dressed as the high priest. These 7 candlesticks, which are the 7 churches, are examined by the Lord to see if they are worthy of being lit or not.
They appear in the first 2 chapters of Revelation. So they constitute the audience to which the author addresses. All these visions from chapter 3 are intended for the believers of these churches. It is like presenting the audience.
These congregations were all in Asia Minor, in the western part of modern-day Turkey.
We can see that these 7 churches constitute like a crown geographically around the great metropolis of Ephesus. We have here an alliance of communities.
Imprisoned on Patmos, how is John going to get these letters to these churches?
I personally think John is still on the island, and he sends a messenger with the written book of Revelation, and he goes from church to church, beginning with Ephesus, and he reads the document then to the Christians as they gather in these churches.
These churches are very real. They lived here 2,000 years ago. They had their problems, their difficulties, their questions, their missteps, etc. On the other hand, they had to be a quorum of 7 because of the symbolic nature of the 7 that is found throughout the Revelation.
The number 7 should be considered a symbolic figure. The number 7 comes up so constantly in the book of Revelation that it cannot be seen as a figure in the arithmetic sense of the word.
7, it is the number of fullness. So the 7 churches represent the universal church. It is the church of all places and all times.
Why have we kept these 7 letters, and why are there no others? Because it's symbolic. In a way, when we made a list of 7, we said it all. We could do more, but it would not add anything because everything is already said.
Through these 7 letters, we must see a message from Christ to all the churches, not only for their time, but universally, which is why the book still concerns us today. In the different characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses of these churches, we must also find our own. And therefore the diagnosis and solutions of Jesus must impact us today.
Christ's intention was to point out their true spiritual state. He encouraged some churches, but exhorted others to take a good look at themselves or radically change their attitude.
It is a balance sheet that is very lucid and so acute, incisive, denouncing problems, which perhaps the church itself does not wish to see.
Some of them are strong in their faith, others are weak in their faith, and some are kind of in between. They're, as we say, straddling the fence. And Jesus, through John, is trying to pull them over and to be full followers of Jesus Christ.
From high above Patmos, I realized that this small, remote Mediterranean island has many secrets. John the Apostle must have looked at this scenery every evening whilst thinking about the revelation that God had entrusted to him and the heavy responsibility of sharing this message with the 7 churches in Asia Minor. I'm aware of the incredible adventure I am embarking upon, for it is time to throw myself into this thrilling investigation which has only just begun. After being exiled in Patmos, John left to pursue his mission in the city of Ephesus, the first of the 7 in Asia Minor. He lived there until his death.